The life of a slave in the United States was nasty, brutish, and short, regardless of sex. The average lifespan for a white man in the United States during 1850 was 40 years old. The average age for a white woman during that same time was 43. The lifespan of a black man during the same time, however, was 7 years shorter at 33, and women 5 years shorter at 38.
The role of men on the plantation was that of a hard laborer. A man would be expected to farm all day and generally work the plantation land. The role of a hard laborer was a tough one, and often men would get done with it, worth work, only to collapse and sleep. The man was also expected to lift or carry anything that needed to be around the plantation, and was generally in poorer physical health than their female counterparts due to the rough life they led.
The role of women on the plantation was generally restricted to the house. Work such as maintaining fires, cleaning, and cooking were not abnormal to female slaves. Also, women were to have children to continue feeding the institution of slavery. A woman might also be expected to perform sexual favors depending on the master, and that led women to generally having poorer mental health as opposed to men.
The punishment for men not completing their duties was a heavy toll. Often whippings and beatings were the normal. Often male slaves would be punished for their perceived disrespect or not meeting quotas on crops. These punishments harmed both the man's physical and mental health.
Women's punishments were both physical and mental. They were punished for a plethora of things such as not cleaning properly, disrespecting their master, or just to make a point. Their punishments consisted of beatings, sexual harassment, and in extreme cases, separation from their family and friends. This of course excludes the harshest punishment of all, death. This, however, was not used as often on women as they could produce more slaves, so they were perceived as more valuable to the owner.
The role of women as slaves can be seen firsthand by the accounts of Harriet Jacobs, a slave who worked near the house. While a slave, she saw the horrors of it. She heard of a family that was cared for by a previous owner, but after a switch in owners, the oldest daughter was taken advantage of by the new master. The oldest soon became a mother, and when the slaveholder's wife looked at the babe, she wept bitterly. She knew that her own husband had violated the purity she had so carefully inoculated. This is the first time Harriet Jacobs had seen how women in slavery are treated.
Harriet Jacobs later went on to experience the abuse of women by slave owners. She too was taken advantage of for sexual favors. Quote, "The influences of slavery had had the same effect on me that they had on other young girls. They had made me prematurely knowing concerning the evil ways of the world." Her role, like many other women, was to do simple house tasks, but also to please their master whenever they felt like it.
The experience that Harriet Jacobs had with her master came to haunt her for the rest of her life. I shudder to think of being the mother of children that should be owned by my old tyrant. When people think of slavery, many imagine the whippings and physical abuses, but many also forget that slavery was painful for slaves mentally as well. Harriet Jacobs remarked, "Yet few slaveholders seem to be aware of the widespread moral ruin occasioned by this wicked system. Their talk of blighted cotton crops, not of the blight on their children's souls." Her remark reflects what many slave mothers and daughters thought during the time.
It is a fact that the jobs of male slaves and female slaves were drastically different. Their punishments, however, were often similar. Frederick Douglass was a slave who saw many of the horrors for himself. One thing he saw was a female slave getting whipped. Quote, "Mr. Whedon owned, among others, a woman slave, whose name I have forgotten. The woman's back, for weeks, was kept literally raw, made so by the lash of this merciless religious wretch." Slave owners did not give women special treatment when it came to punishments. They would be whipped and beaten just as badly as any male slave.
Although Frederick Douglass was a male slave, he was able to perceive how bad female slaves were treated sexually. While under the rule of Mr. Covey, a slave owner, Douglass saw him force a female slave into sex. I do verily believe that he sometimes deceived himself into the solemn belief that he was a sincere worshipper of the Most High God, and this too at a time when he may be said to have been guilty of compelling this woman slave to commit the sin of adultery. He was able to buy one slave, and shockingly, as is the fact, he bought her, as he said, for a breeder. Douglass's view on the subject highlights one of the key differences between male slaves and female slaves.